Ken Cuccinelli has 39%, and Libertarian candidate Robert Sarvis 10%.
The U.S. Senate is about to start the day, with more work ahead on a bill providing temporary funding for the federal government from October 1st through December 15th, known as a Continuing Resolution, or CR. Passed by the House last week, it would also defund the health care law. Yesterday, Majority Leader Reid filed an amendment that would strip the health care law defunding language and would shorten the length of the CR by 1 month, from December 15th to November 15th. The next procedural vote is scheduled for tomorrow, although senators may agree to push that up to today. A final passage vote is expected by this weekend. Now live to the Senate floor on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. God of love and light, you never fail those who trust you. As people make contingency plans for a possible government shutdown, give us your grace in our difficulties, enabling us to rest in the assurance of your wisdom and love. Lord, when our senators have done their part in all honesty and diligence, may they resolutely commit themselves to the unfolding of your loving providence. Teach them to say, even in dark seasons, Father, let your will be done. Forgive us our penchant for division as you stir our hearts to look for common ground. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 26, 2013, to the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. I'm Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Majority Leader.
Following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume consideration of the continuing resolution. At 10:30 this morning, after Senator McConnell and I finish our remarks, the majority and the Republicans will control alternating 1-hour blocks, with the majority controlling the first hour. I filed cloture last evening on the continuing resolution. As a result, the filing deadline for all first-degree amendments to the resolution is 1 p.m. today. Absent consent, the cloture vote will occur 1 hour after the Senate convenes tomorrow, Friday. Mr. President, as I said yesterday, I'll tell everyone here again today, we know what the end is like here, that we can finish this sometime Saturday. But it would seem to me that we should do everything we can to get this back to the House as quickly as we can. So it would be my suggestion that we have the ability to wrap this thing up today. And I would suggest that would be the most, that would be the best thing to do. But it's up to my Republican colleagues as to whether they will let that happen. Mr. President, yesterday I warned of the economic consequences if a few extremist Republicans force a government shutdown. Already the stock market has slipped, and that's an understatement. 5 days in a row, the longest continuous period since 2012, the stock market's gone down. And they all say it's a result of the fear of the government shutting down. And why should the financial markets feel any differently? People are still speaking about closing the government. Now, the talk by a few over here, Republicans have stopped the last 24 hours, but you know, they over there are taking up where the long talk over here ended. Close the government. The Tea Party is still insisting on a shutdown. Hard to comprehend, but it's true. The dark consequences don't end just by saying that. If the federal government closes its doors, seniors applying for Social Security won't be able to apply. Veterans applying for disability will not be able to apply. They'd be forced to wait until the federal workers return to their posts. Mr. President, the FBI, because of sequestration and other anomalies we have around here anymore, are talking about furloughing their employees, closing their offices 1 day a week. Across the country, mortgage loans and small businesses would be delayed. Members of the military will be forced to defend this country without even a paycheck as thanks. And billions of dollars will drain from the economy every day the government is closed for business. Now, Mr. President, this is not hyperbole, not conjecture, it's the truth. Because if you look back at history, it pretty well determines where you are on a given day. And if you look back when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans controlled Congress, the House of Representatives, they shut down the government in 1995 because President Clinton wouldn't meet their every demand. And it cost the country tens of billions of dollars. So yesterday I urged Republicans to consider the impact of a shutdown on the recovery. But the economic price of shutting down the government shouldn't be the only thing keeping Republicans up at night. They should worry about the political consequences as well. Mr. President, we are all politicians, all 100 of us. And a new poll, brand new poll, CBS, respected organization, says 80% of Americans, that's almost as much as favor background checks on guns. 80% of Americans, you rarely get 80% of Americans to agree on anything, but they agree that those that want the government to be held hostage to extract these concessions are somebody they won't vote for. Mr. President, 75% of Republicans feel that way in this poll. So those of us who remember the government shutdowns of 95 and 96 know the story didn't end well for Republicans. Just ask Charles Krauthammer. There is no more respected, conservative, really conservative columnist than Charles Krauthammer. He's penned a conservative column for the Washington Post since the 80s. Here's what he wrote just a week or two ago. Quote, "Every fiscal showdown has redounded against the Republicans. The first in 1995 effectively marked the end of the Gingrich Revolution." Direct quote. As they did in the 90s, today's radical Republicans have called for concessions they know we will never agree to. Senate Democrats won't agree, and the President won't agree. The Senate will never pass, nor will President Obama sign a bill that guts the Affordable Care Act and denies millions of Americans access to life-saving health care. The statement made by John McCain yesterday said it all. Now, he had some credentials to talk about that, Mr. President. He was the Republican nominee for President of the United States. He didn't like what happened with health care, and he talked about it here. He wished it hadn't passed, but it passed. He said it was a fair fight, and he and the Republicans lost. Move on to something else is what he said. The Senate will never pass, as I've indicated before, a bill that guts Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Tea Party Republicans have demanded the impossible and vowed to shut down the government unless they get it. Mr. Krauthammer, I don't agree all the time, but he aptly measured the fallout from the shutdowns of the mid-90s and correctly predicted a similar result from a modern shutdown. He wrote, what nearly 24 mainstream Republicans have also said, quote, this gambit is doomed to fail. He also wrote, this is about tactics. If I thought this would work, I would support it, but I don't fancy suicide. It has a tendency to be fatal. That's an understatement, Mr. President. That's close quote. I commend Republican senators who have spoken up in favor of reason. Now, you can't imagine how satisfied I am, because that's how we used to get things done here. I can look back at John Breaux from Louisiana. If he thought we weren't doing enough on this side of the aisle, he reached out to the Republicans and worked something out. So what Republican senators said the last few days is really important. They've spoken out for reason, calling the Tea Party's shutdown ultimatum a box canyon, a suicide note, and the dumbest idea ever. Although these reasonable Republicans dislike Obamacare as much as their more radical colleagues, they also realize the futility and the danger of political hostage-taking. They know this country can't be governed by one faction of one party on one side of the Capitol. Governing must be a cooperative effort that sets aside the ideological or parochial concerns in favor of what is best for the nation, for the economy, and for middle-class families. On November 14, 1995, the first day of the first government shutdown, President Clinton urged Republicans in Congress to govern with him instead of fighting against him. This is what he said. There is, after all, a simple solution to the problem. All Congress has to do is pass a straightforward bill to let government perform its duties and pay its debts. Then we can get back to work and resolve our differences in an open, honest, and straightforward manner. Mr. President, I do every Thursday when we're in session a welcome to Washington. And a lady from Boulder City, Nevada came up to me. She said, I work for the Park Service. And we're so afraid. The Park Service, we don't know what we're going to do. Last time there was a government shutdown, the parks closed. There's so much confusion. That's the way it is throughout government. So, Mr. President, I offer today the same advice that President Clinton gave in 1995. Let government perform its duties. The way out of this predicament is as simple today as it was in 1995. And so, again, I invite my Republican colleagues to return with me to the time when we worked to resolve our differences in an open, honest, and straightforward manner. Mr. President, I'm going to take a few minutes. I apologize to my Republican counterpart. But we have to understand, the American people have to understand how serious what is going on around here. Tom Friedman wrote yesterday in his op-ed piece that he's a renowned syndicated columnist. He's won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. He's had 6 or 7 best-selling books. Now, I'm not going to read everything he wrote, but I'll read a little bit that he wrote yesterday. The Republican Party is being taken over by a Tea Party faction that is not interested in governing on any of the big issues: immigration, gun control, health care, debt, and taxes. Where, with just minimal compromises between the two parties, we'd amplify our strength so much that we'd separate ourselves from the rest of the world. Instead, this group is threatening to shut down the government and undermine America's vital credit rating if it doesn't get its way. This kind of madness helped to produce the idiotic sequester, the $1.2 trillion in automatic, arbitrary, and across-the-board budget cuts from beginning in 2013 that is already undermining one of our strongest assets. And here he goes. Ask Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, the crown jewel of American biotech innovation. In fiscal year 2013, the sequester required the NIH to cut $1.6 billion across the board. 5.5% of each of its 27 institutes and centers, irrespective of whether one was on the cusp of a medical breakthrough and another was not. There was still an ability with each institute to make adjustments, but as NIH director, I could not decide to emphasize cancer research and down modulate something else, Collins explained. Because of the sequester and the fact that the NIH has been losing ground to inflation over 10 years, we will not be able to fund 640 research grants that were scored in the top 17% of proposals we received, Collins said. He goes on to say, they would have been funded without the sequester, but now they won't. They include new ideas on cancer, diabetes, autism, heart disease, all the things that we as a country say are a high priority. I can't say which of these grants would have led to a next breakthrough or which investigator would be a Nobel Prize winner years from now. Of these 640 top research proposals, 150 were from scientists financed in the previous budget cycle who had returned to the NIH to secure funding for another 3 years because they thought they were really onto something and a peer review board agreed. Now we're cutting them off, Collins said. So you damage the previous investment as well as the future one. In 2014, the NIH was planning to offer new money to stimulate research proposals in a dozen areas, including how to speed up the use of stem cells to cure Parkinson's and other diseases, how to better manage pain and sickle cell disease, and how to improve early diagnosis of autism. All were shelved because of the sequester, said Collins. Why ask people to submit applications we would just have to turn down? In addition, in 2013, the NIH had to turn away from its research hospital 750 patients who wanted to be part of a clinical trial for disorders which medicine currently has no answers. America's biomedical ecosystem depends heavily on NIH doing basic research, and the private sector won't do it. So we're cutting the medical research that has potential to prevent and cure the very diseases that are driving health care costs upward. In short, we're cutting without a plan, the worst thing a country or company can do. And we're doing it because one of our two parties has been taken over by angry radicals and barking fools, and the old leadership is running scared. But when the Republican Party goes this far off the rails, it is even remotely challenging President Obama to challenge his base on taxes and entitlements. And thus, does a great country with so much potential slowly become ungreat. Mr. President, not only do we have sequestration now, they want to even do more and shut the government down, not extend the debt ceiling. This is a bad time for America. I hope people come to their senses.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Later this morning in Maryland, the President will try yet again to sell his namesake health care plan to an increasingly skeptical public. He'll claim that Americans will have lots and lots of options under Obamacare. Unfortunately, keeping the plan you have and like will not be an option for a great many Americans. And it must be frustrating for the President that folks seem to keep tuning out all this happy talk. But it's not hard to see, frankly, why Americans aren't buying the spin. Over the past couple of years, I've participated in more than 50 health care town halls in my home state. I've met with health care professionals, doctors, and nurses. I've met with patients, and I've met with everyday Kentuckians, folks who are just concerned about providing health care for their families. Many of the Kentuckians I've met with are a lot more knowledgeable about Obamacare than the Washington intelligentsia might like to assume. In fact, more than a few of them seem to know more about the law than some of my colleagues who rammed it through Congress. And let's be clear, a person doesn't need a Ph.D. to understand that a law that drives costs up rather than down is a bad deal. Kentuckians understand that the new government bureaucracies are less likely to lower costs and improve care than they are to just simply get in the way. And so it is for these and so many other reasons that Kentuckians and people right across this country are rightly concerned about Obamacare. 2 nights ago, I had another great opportunity to connect on this issue with Kentuckians via a teletown hall. And I'll tell you, the good people of my state are as concerned about this law as ever. One woman who participated said she thought she had been making it, but reports that she will now be forced to get a second job due in no small part to Obamacare. I've received more than 50,000 letters from constituents frustrated by Obamacare as well. Single parents want to know what they're supposed to do when their hours are cut. Families want to know why Washington is okay with their insurance premiums going up by double digits. Small business owners want to know how they're ever going to comply with more than 20,000 pages of regulations. They want to know how they're going to be able to keep their employees insured. Workforce is growing, businesses expanding, and far too often their doors open once this law comes online. One Kentuckian from Henderson wrote to tell me about the small trucking business she and her husband own. They've got 13 employees, and they've always provided insurance for all of them. But their agent recently told them their premiums will go up 100% increase in premiums. Here's what she wrote to me. We can't afford this, even if we raise the portion the employees pay. Then they wouldn't be able to afford it. That was the experience reported to me by a woman and her husband running a small business in Henderson. These are the utterly predictable consequences of a law rammed through by a Democratic majority over the objections of the American people early on a cold, dark Christmas Eve morning. Until a few brave Democrats join our united Republican conference in voting to get rid of Obamacare and starting over with a real bipartisan reform, we're going to continue hearing the same heart-wrenching stories over and over and over again. We're going to keep seeing articles like the one that appeared earlier this week in Politico. It's titled, Obamacare, One Blow After Another. Obamacare, one blow after another. And I want to read the opening paragraph. The Obamacare that consumers will finally be able to sign up for next week, it says, is a long way from the health plan President Obama first pitched to the nation. Among other things, this story notes that millions of low-income Americans won't receive coverage, and a growing number of workers won't get to keep their employer-provided coverage. And just yesterday, we heard the District of Columbia's exchange hit a huge bump in the road just days before launch. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more stories of these types of problems popping up all across our country. Let's talk about premiums, too. A few weeks ago, one veteran at a town hall wanted to know how this law could possibly be free. This veteran said, how could this possibly be free? Of course, it's not free. He was right. And premiums are part of that story. Based on the administration's own data, along with some intrepid reporting, here's how much more a single 27-year-old can expect to pay under Obamacare in Columbus, Ohio. 436% increase for a 27-year-old under Obamacare in Columbus, Ohio. In Charlotte, North Carolina, it's 523%. Little Rock, 613% more. 613%. Imagine for a moment, you're 27, you've done everything right, you've studied hard, graduated from college, you've got student loan debt, car payments, car insurance payments, utility bills, rent, renter's insurance, 401k contributions, health insurance, of course. Then there's gas, food, and maybe, just maybe occasionally, having a little bit of fun. And then you lose your employer-sponsored health plans thanks to Obamacare. You get dumped into the exchanges. So jack up those monthly health insurance payments by 300, 500, even 600%. What are you supposed to do now? Go uninsured and pay penalty taxes? Stop contributing to your retirement account? You can't very well give up the car you need to get to work, or food, or paying back your student loans. One of these is a good option, Mr. President. And they're not good for our society either. We shouldn't be setting up disincentives for 27-year-olds to insure themselves or contribute to their own retirement. But this is just the incentive structure that Obamacare creates. And when you consider how hard the Obama economy has hammered millennials already, it's hardly fair to whack them again, especially when so many are just barely hanging on as it is. So this law is a mess. It needs to go. It's way past time to start over. And as I've been saying all week, we need just 5 brave Democrats to join us to make that happen. So I hope some of our Democratic friends who voted for this law will look themselves in the mirror and think, truly think, about whether protecting the President's pride is really more important than helping the American people. Because we owe our constituents better than Obamacare. We can do better than this. And with your help, we can do that. With your help, we can start over with the kind of real bipartisan reform that Kentuckians and Americans are actually hoping for. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of J.Res 59, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 195, J.Res 59, making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the time will be controlled in 1-hour increments, with the majority controlling the first hour and alternating thereafter. Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, the families that I talk to in my home state of Washington are not interested in partisan back and forth that we see so much of here in Washington, D.C. They are thinking about how they're going to get their bills paid. And they're wondering when and if they'll be able to save enough to retire. And they're hoping that they're going to be able to give their children a better future. They rightfully expect us to focus on strengthening the economy and creating jobs, which will make it easier for them to reach those important goals. Now, we've had an opportunity, many opportunities in the last few months, to move forward on legislation like the Senate budget and the appropriations bills that were approved in Senator Mikulski's committee, which could remove some of the uncertainty that is putting a drag on our economic recovery. But instead, we are here today on the floor of the Senate to debate a temporary stopgap measure to fund the government just days away from a possible shutdown. Now, I think all but a few of my colleagues would agree with me that these circumstances are far from ideal. So as we work to pass this bill, this temporary stopgap bill, and continue negotiations on the longer term budget deal, I think it's really important to consider exactly how we got to this point, what this continuing resolution means in the context of ongoing discussions, and what needs to happen for us to reach a more comprehensive agreement that works for our families and for our economy. Now, as we all remember, Mr. President, if Democrats and many Republicans as well had their way, we could have begun a bipartisan budget conference between the House and Senate months ago and prevented this chaos. When the Senate passed a budget, I was very hopeful that both sides would come together and work out an agreement that would end this cycle of governing by crisis and allow us to focus on creating jobs and economic growth. Well, Democrats have come to the floor 18 times now, 18 times, to try to begin a bipartisan conference with the House on our budget resolutions. Many Republicans thought this made sense. They agreed we should at least sit down and try to get a deal. But, as we all know now, an extreme minority of the Republicans saw things differently, and they believed they would have more leverage if they created a crisis, like the one we're approaching now, than a few months ago when there wasn't a looming deadline. And those Tea Party Republicans, backed by the Republican leadership, stood up and said no to the bipartisan budget negotiations 18 times against the wishes of members on both sides of the aisle. So today, when we could have been focusing on the real challenges Americans are facing, we are instead focused on preventing the Tea Party from shutting down the government. All because Tea Party Republicans want another shot at dismantling the Affordable Care Act, which, by the way, was passed by a supermajority, upheld by the Supreme Court, and was a major issue the American people weighed in on in the 2012 election. Mr. President, in the House continuing resolution, Tea Party Republicans are fighting to take away health care coverage for millions of Americans and get rid of crucial services like prevention and wellness visits for Medicare patients, prescription drug savings for our seniors that we fought so hard for, and coverage for over 92,000 Americans who have pre-existing conditions. This is absurd. It is a non-starter. There is no way Democrats are going to give in to these demands that are so clearly harmful to the American people. And the same is true of the fight that Tea Party Republicans are trying to pick over the debt limit. Now, some Republicans claim it's typical to threaten a catastrophic and unprecedented default in order to extract political concessions. But the fact is the opposite is true. The vast majority of debt limit increases in the last 3 decades occurred independent of efforts to reduce the deficit or put in place budget reforms. And while Democrats are more than happy to negotiate on the budget, and we've been trying to do that for the last 6 months, we do stand firmly behind President Obama and are not going to negotiate about whether the United States of America pays its bills. We believe families and businesses should not have to deal with any more of that uncertainty. And honestly, Mr. President, I do think a lot of Republicans agree. More than a dozen Republicans have spoken out to discourage the Tea Party from starting a pointless debate over defunding the Affordable Care Act in the bill to prevent a government shutdown. And I know that quite a few Republicans agree brinksmanship over the debt ceiling is the height of irresponsibility. Mr. President, given all the infighting we've seen recently, governing by crisis clearly isn't working for Republicans. It's certainly not helping Democrats make the investments we feel very strongly our country needs to succeed in the 21st century, and it has put a completely unnecessary burden on our families and our economy. It seems the only ones benefiting from this perpetual crisis mode are Tea Party Republicans, and I see no reason to keep doing them any favors. So I would like to call on the House Republicans to cut the Tea Party loose, give up these partisan games, and pass the Senate's bill to prevent a government shutdown. Now, this bill by no means is a permanent fix. It is not even close. It is temporary, and it continues the cuts from sequestration that are already in place and locked into law until we get a bipartisan deal. But it will keep our government operating while those negotiations continue, and that is critical. Because even though some might not be able to see it here in Washington, D.C., a government shutdown will have serious consequences for families across this country. My home state of Washington is home to more than 100,000 uniformed and civilian defense employees at places like Joint Base Lewis McChord and Fairchild Air Force Base. Mr. President, if this government shuts down, those men and women in uniform will still have to go to work the next day, but they won't get paid for it. Thousands of civilian defense employees in places like Tacoma and Whidbey Island and Spokane would be forced to do the same, and thousands more could face furloughs. Mr. President, these hardworking Americans and families across my state and the country are already dealing with the consequences of gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, D.C. They are dealing with the across-the-board cuts from sequestration, which continue to pile up. Hundreds of thousands of our defense employees who are now having to wonder about the effects of a shutdown have been furloughed already and have taken pay cuts. Crucial supports and opportunities for vulnerable families and communities, from Head Start to Meals on Wheels, have been slashed, and sequestration is crippling our ability to plan for the future and make the kinds of investments in research and education and infrastructure that will help our workers succeed. Now, I hear about the impact of these arbitrary cuts whenever I'm home in Washington State. I know every single one of my colleagues here has heard similar stories. Now, the cuts are only going to get worse with time, and they simply have to go. So, Mr. President, when we send this legislation back to the House, Republicans have got to put an end to the Tea Party temper tantrums and pass our bill without any gimmicks and without any games. And after we do that, I hope we can leave the Tea Party brinksmanship behind, so those of us on both sides of the aisle who believe in common sense bipartisanship can move forward with negotiations on a desperately needed longer-term deal. And in those negotiations, I'm going to continue fighting for an agreement that ends this governing by crisis and supports our families and economies by replacing sequestration with smarter deficit reduction, evenly divided between spending cuts and new revenue from the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. Now, I'm fully aware that the Republicans have their priorities as well, and I have never said that reaching an agreement would be easy, but I know many Democrats and Republicans are sick of brinksmanship and crisis. I know they understand, like we do, that compromise is part of our job description. And I truly believe if those Republicans work with Democrats, we can reach that critically needed, fair, bipartisan agreement that we've been working towards. Mr. President, I've heard some of the Tea Party Republicans here in Washington, D.C. dismiss the damaging and costly disruptions a shutdown could cause. Some even seem to think that a default wouldn't be that bad, despite warnings from countless economists that default would be, in fact, catastrophic. But Americans across the country who are still fighting to get back on their feet don't have the luxury of dismissing these risks, because they are the ones who are going to be affected, and they are rightfully expecting us to work together and reach a fair budget agreement that offers hardworking families more opportunity and more security. I believe putting the gimmicks and games aside and keeping the government open is a necessary step towards that goal. So I'm going to vote for this temporary continuing resolution and against the Tea Party's dysfunction and brinksmanship. And I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same. Mr. President, part of the reason I'm confident that we can reach an agreement is because I know what we can do when we do work together. During this last summer, I worked with Senator Collins to write the Transportation and Housing Appropriations Bill for the coming fiscal year. It included priorities of members on both sides of the aisle, and it was approved in our committee with the support of 6 Republicans. That bill received that strong bipartisan support because it helps families and it helps communities. It gets workers back on the job. It was fiscally responsible, and it laid down a strong foundation for long-term and broad-based economic growth. Our bill stands in stark contrast with the across-the-board sequestration cuts we have been operating under for the last 6 months. Rather than slashing crucial investments in our infrastructure, our bill supports critical transportation projects across the country, and it fully funds the highway and transit grant programs that allow our states and local agencies to keep our transportation system working. Rather than leaving our cities and towns who have been hit hard by the recession to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, our bill strongly supports community development grants, which offer the tools to strengthen small businesses and local economies. Instead of asking the most vulnerable to bear the burden of spending cuts, our bill funds a critical piece of the safety net, housing assistance, homeless shelters for millions of struggling families and seniors who are just one step away from the street. Mr. President, as any business owner will tell you, it makes no sense to slash the investments that allow you to compete and prosper in the long term just to make the numbers work in the short term. And the investments that are laid out in our bill are great examples. They make our country stronger by supporting job creation and economic growth, and by keeping our commitment to help those most in need to get back on their feet. The need for these investments far exceeds the resources in our bill, but the bill that Senator Collins and I wrote keeps our commitment to our states and to our communities and makes sure the agencies in the bill can meet their statutory responsibilities. That will not be the case if sequestration continues for yet another year, which would make these commitments impossible to keep. And it's important to note, Mr. President, that the Housing and Transportation Bill addresses challenges our country faces today. A full-year bill enables Congress to adjust funding levels to meet current needs and to implement new policies that address the problems that have come to light in recent years. This is something that does not happen when we opt for long-term continuing resolutions. For example, as a great example, we know that 1 in every 4 of our bridges is now considered deficient by the Federal Highway Administration. Our bill includes funding to repair or replace deficient bridges across the country in order to protect the safety and reliability of our transportation system. If we simply extend the funding levels that we debated 2 years ago, then those investments and many others that create jobs and protect public safety and support the most vulnerable will be lost. And we'll also lose the improvements our bill makes to programs, including reforms that address concerns members have raised the last time the Transportation and Housing Bill came here to the Senate floor. Our bill, Mr. President, includes important Section 8 reforms that will reduce costs and create efficiencies. It contains reforms to improve the oversight of public housing agencies and boards and assures accountability for property owners that don't maintain the quality of their HUD-assisted housing, and it increases accountability in the CDBG program. Mr. President, it's so important that we enact those reforms and do the important oversight of federal programs and agencies that the public expects us to do. So for all those reasons, Mr. President, we need to pass this continuing resolution so we keep the government running, and then we've got to move forward on a longer-term budget agreement that replaces sequestration with more responsible deficit reduction. A bill that puts our families and our economy first and allows us to enact real, thoughtful solutions to our country's challenges instead of these stopgap measures that do not move us forward. Investing in our families, in our communities, and long-term economic growth shouldn't be partisan. And I think that the bipartisan work that went into the Housing and Transportation Bill and the strong support that it received in committee proves they don't have to be. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the Democratic amendment to the House continuing resolution. We have offered this amendment because its content offers a clear path forward to do 3 things. Number 1, avoid a government shutdown. Number 2, to lay the groundwork for ending sequester, that for hopefully the next 2 years, which means finding a way to reduce our public debt in each of those years by $100 million. And number 3, to get rid of the theatrical, veto bait
provocative amendments that are in the House bill calling for the defunding of the President's Affordable Care Act and also for the way they structure public debt. We offer this amendment because we think it is the best way forward. The American people expect to do our job. Now, it is Thursday morning, 11:15, and we're just getting on the amendment. And why? Because for the last several days, we had to put up with theatrical politics rather than get the job done. Senate deliberation. We have gone from being the greatest deliberative body in the world to the greatest delay body in the world. The American people are fed up, and so are many of us here. When all is said and done, more gets said than gets done. Now, this is the time to act. We have an amendment on the floor. It's open for full debate, and I'm absolutely for that. But we need to do the business of government to be able to do our job. Now, we must replace the sequester and allow a 2014 omnibus appropriations to move forward before the end of the year. Now, that sentence alone shows what's wrong in communicating with the American people. Factually, it is accurate. It is absolutely truthful. But nobody understands sequester. Nobody understands the words like omnibus. And nobody understands what we're doing, or most of all, what we are not doing. Now, sequester was an invention by the Congress working with the President to say that we will reduce public debt over a 10-year period by $110 billion a year. If we fail, and to do it in a balanced way, strategic cuts, a review of mandatory spending, and additional revenue. And if we fail to do that, sequester triggers, which means across-the-board cuts, 50% in defense, 50% in domestic. Now, the problem with the across-the-board cuts is it cuts good programs as well as programs that are dated, duplicative, or dysfunctional. I oppose that. I'd rather make strategic cuts arrived at by the committee that I chair, the Appropriations Committee. For the last year, our committee has done its due diligence. Our job is to review programs and to put them in the federal checkbook and bring them to the floor for debate, for amendment, and then for passage and to send to the President. What we want to do in this bill, in our amendment, is to change the date from the House bill from December 15th to November 15th to keep the pressure on to get the deal needed so Congress can get to work and enact 12 fiscally responsible appropriations bills, lay the groundwork for canceling sequester for 2 years, and invest in America's needs today and the needs of the future. This amendment is important for 2 reasons. It prevents a government shutdown. The President has already said he will veto any bill that defunds Obamacare. He will veto any bill that undermines the full faith and credit of the United States. You can huff and puff for 21 hours, but you can't blow Obamacare away. I will repeat, you can huff and puff for 21 hours, but you can't be like the magic dragon that blows the Affordable Care Act away. So if we pass the House continuing resolution, the President will veto it. More wasted time of getting the job done. Our agencies, instead of doing the job of fulfilling their mission, making wise use of taxpayers' money, being responsive to the American people, they're into spending their energy into planning for a shutdown, which amounts to a slam down. The President can sign the continuing resolution and keep the government opening if we pass the Senate amendment, which will keep the government open until November 15th, which gives us 1 month to arrive at pragmatic solutions, cancels the provocative elements in it, the elimination of Obamacare and the public debt, and also lays the groundwork for moving forward. There will just be a few things that will happen if we can't enact a clean continuing resolution, meaning keeping the government open by October 1st. There are consequences here. This isn't just about showbiz. Government has to be open for business. An estimated 800,000 civil servants will be sent home or furloughed. Now, what does that mean? You know, if you're an FBI agent during this time, you will be on your job. You will be at your duty station. But when you're working, you won't get paid. You'll get an IOU. What does that say to people who put themselves in the line of fire? Shutting down the government means that we will affect crucial research and life-saving discoveries will be put on hold. The NIH Clinical Center won't be able to admit new patients for new clinical trials. Weather forecasters, food safety inspectors, those involved with public safety will be at their duty station, but they're going to be earning IOUs, looking forward to across-the-board cuts, which means they could be furloughed, when we've already told them there'll be no cost of living increase for 3 years. And we want to recruit the best and the brightest for the FBI to oversee our drug approval process, or to be border control agents, work that is dirty and dangerous out there. What are we doing here? We show a contempt for the people who work for the government, and that also shows the contempt for the people who pay for the government. Our government should be working as hard as the people who pay the taxes to support the government. The way they work hard is to put the money in there for the mission and purpose of these agencies, insist that they do their job, and then we insist that we get rid of the dated, the duplicative, and the dysfunctional. We lay the groundwork for doing this. And in fact, we've been doing it all year long. I chair the Appropriations Committee. It is made up of 12 subcommittees. You'll be hearing from my subcommittee chairman throughout the day. I am so proud of them. For the last year, they've listened, they've taken the president's budget, they've analyzed it, they've conducted hearings they've reviewed it, they've scrubbed it, they've analyzed it, and they've squeezed it. I'm really proud of them. And out of what they're ready to bring to the Senate floor keeps the mission and purpose intact, makes wise use of of taxpayers' dollars, has listened at every single hearing to inspector generals where we learn about the dated, dysfunctional, or duplicative, and we're ready to move. But we can't move if we have the theatrical showdown politics. Now, this has grave impact. What we're here with shutdown politics and eventually slow down through sequester. What we are facing here is that it will have a negative impact on our economy. It will add to the uncertainty for businesses to be able to make wise decisions. It will also slow down, in a way, the impact through jobs. We fund infrastructure and other needed programs. It will impact public safety, and it will impact our future generations because of the big hit on research and development that comes up with the new ideas for the new jobs. Later on today, I will be talking about the NIH, which is in my state. Yes, the NIH, because of NIH funding, thousands of people work in Maryland, but thousands of people are working for the United States of America. And what is it? At the end of the day, they're trying to come up with cures. and cures that can be where we create. So we're talking about saving lives, doing the basic research that then helps us have jobs in biomedical and pharmaceuticals, and also be able to improve the lives of our people, improve our economy, and get the job done. So, Mr. President, I will have more to say, but right now I want to turn to Senator Pryor, who's the chair of the Agricultural Subcommittee. He's a new chairman, but he's not new to getting the job done. In fact, we refer to him as Tightwad Pryor. He has looked at the programs. He has really analyzed how we are truly going to get value for the dollar and at the same time feed the hungry, care for the sick, feed the hungry here and around the world, and also make sure that that important, vibrant sector of our economy, the agricultural industry, is viable. I yield the floor to Senator Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would, before I get started, I'd ask unanimous consent that Bob Ross, a detailee from the Department of Agriculture to the Committee on Appropriations, and Mike Hallinan, a fellow in my personal office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the 113th Congress.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the Agriculture Appropriations Bill, but I have to start by thanking our chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee. She has already done so many good things for that committee and for the Senate, and obviously she's been a great senator for the state of Maryland, and we see that greatness as she leads the Appropriations Committee. And I thank all the members of the Appropriations Committee, both Democrats and Republicans, would like to thank her for her service and her leadership. Mr. President, today I do want to talk about the Agriculture Appropriations Bill and the impact a government shutdown would have on the activities it supports and the negative ripple effects, and there would be many negative ripple effects that would come to our nation's economy if that, in fact, does happen. You know, Mr. President, when people hear the phrase agriculture appropriations, they naturally think about farmers, and that is certainly a key part of what is in our agriculture sector and in this bill, but that is certainly not all that it does. The bill helps farmers with things like operating loans and conservation projects and marketing. All those are very important, but it also funds programs that benefit rural communities to do things like supply clean drinking water for people in rural areas and housing. It supports nutrition programs. It helps kids all across the country, but it also not only does food, things like the international food programs, programs like Food for Peace, etc., but it also has the Food and Drug Administration in it. And that's critically important. We need a strong, robust FDA. This bill has been very bipartisan. This bill is about investing in our future. What we do here in this bill is we actually try to save money. We understand there are budget constraints on. We get that. We want to lead the way by responsible governing, by making sure that we do things in the right way, by making smart, targeted investments and saving taxpayer dollars by eliminating redundancies and streamlining loan programs and doing things to make the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the FDA spend their money wisely. But at the same time, we are trying very hard not to reduce any services on hardworking Americans, and we're also certainly trying not to hurt any industries in this country. Sequestration is already taking a toll on many of these programs. You look at the cuts that these agencies have had to undergo in the last 2 or 3 years, you're already seeing a strain on the budgets and difficulties there. A government shutdown would wreak havoc in our economy. And I think I speak for most Americans, certainly most Arkansans, when I say I am currently undergoing shutdown fatigue. We're tired of this. We're tired of the drama. We're tired of, honestly, the other chamber embarrassing the Congress and doing these dramatics. And people are just tired of it. And when I'm home in Arkansas and I'm filling up at the gas station or I'm at the grocery store or I'm at the ball game or wherever I happen to be, people come up to me and say, what is wrong with Congress? In fact, I was at a major fundraising event for cancer research in Little Rock on Friday evening. I bet I had a dozen people come up to me and say, what is going on with the House of Representatives? Why do they continue to do this? And I agree, Mr. President. It's hard to watch. It's not good for the Congress. Like I said, I have shutdown fatigue. We don't need any more drama. We need to get back to the business of governing. And let me tell you, governing isn't always easy. We have to make hard decisions. That's why we run for these jobs. We run for these jobs to do things and to get things done and to try to make good and wise decisions for our people and for our nation. And that's the way it's supposed to work. And I think my colleagues will agree with me when I say that strengthening our economy and creating jobs is our #1 priority right now. We look at the recession we've been through. We see the hardships folks have gone through. Strengthening our economy and creating jobs is our #1 priority. And this bill will help us do it. Again, it's hard to get to that #1 priority when you have some of the shenanigans going on here in the U.S. House and some of the this manufactured crisis that they've created. But what I want to say about agriculture is that it is one of the core strengths in the U.S. economy. Listen, we do a lot of things well. Our economy does a lot of things well, but no one does agriculture better than America. It's something we should be proud of. Quite honestly, we do it so well we probably take it for granted sometimes, but it is a core strength in the U.S. economy. And if you just want one little bit of evidence for that, look at our trade deficit. Everyone in this chamber knows that our trade deficit is not good. We know it's bad. We know it's ugly. We want to change that. We want to make it better. But our trade deficit would be horrendous. It would be horrendous if it were not for agriculture. That is our #1 export. This is something that we need to be mindful of. Agriculture is very, very good for the U.S. economy. And you take something as simple, and I mean, here again, we take this for granted, but you take something as simple as raising chickens. And that, that's not very exciting. A lot of people don't understand the first thing about it. But you have to think about what impact that has on the states and the counties and the communities where this happens. First, someone has to build the chicken house. Someone has to deliver the chicks. Someone delivers the feed. Someone has to maintain the trucks that deliver the chicks and the feed. Someone has to generate the electricity. Someone has to supply the water. Somebody's paying taxes on all this, and it's helping local schools and local police and fire, etc. Someone at some point picks up the chickens, and then they deliver them to the processing plant, and it all starts over and over. Someone had to build a plant. Someone has to do this. Someone had to do that. There's a huge ripple effect in the U.S. economy on everything about agriculture. It's not just the farmers. It's not just the farmers. It is the ripple effect and the positive it has, effect it has on the economy. So let me just take an example of Arkansas. Arkansas, and I'm sure this is true in many other states. I haven't looked at the numbers, but I bet this is true in 35 or 40 other states. And that is, it is our largest industry. Listen, we love having our Fortune 500 companies there, and we have several that are based in Arkansas. We have even more than that that have some sort of facility there, some plant or some site of some sort. We love that, and we're proud of that. But agriculture is our =1 industry. 1 in 6 jobs in Arkansas is tied to agriculture. It's $17 billion net effect on the economy, and it's 25% of our state's economy. Here again, if you went to other states, I was talking to Debbie Stabenow not too long ago, and she says, in Michigan, we're all known for manufacturing and heavy manufacturing, and they are, but she said our second largest industry is agriculture. And she's chairman of the Ag Committee. She's fought very hard to get the Farm Bill back on track, and much to her credit, she's moved that ball further down the field than I think just about anyone else could. But another reason that I want the House to stop with this manufactured crisis and to follow the Senate's lead and to pass a common-sense, comprehensive farm bill. And I don't say that lightly. I have a lot of respect for the House. Certainly there are separate separate institution within this branch of government. I certainly have a lot of respect for that and their position and their role. It's critical. But they need to follow the Senate's lead on this. They need to follow the Senate and do what the Senate has done. We're trying to be responsible. We're trying to show leadership here. We're trying to get things back on track. But, you know, when I mentioned Arkansas just a moment ago, we're not alone in this. There are over 3 million farmers in the U.S., and agriculture, as a nation, agriculture employs about 22 million people. And the Ag Appropriations Bill, as we call it, the Ag Appropriations Bill, would allow us to build on this economic powerhouse that we have in this country. You know, this bill helps farmers get started, it helps farmers increase their yield, and it helps them become better stewards of the land. Funding these programs creates jobs in rural America. And let me tell you, if you hadn't been there recently, rural America needs jobs. So you take a program like the USDA Rural Development Programs, they create construction jobs. They rebuild homes and schools and other facilities, and they keep our rural communities strong. We don't want the tale of two nations here where you have urban and suburban America and then rural America, and rural America is just left behind. We don't want that. We want rural America to be strong as well. Almost every member of this body has sizable rural portions of their state. We want those area of those states to grow and be prosperous. And so we, in this bill, provide guaranteed loans for rural businesses to let them grow, to get small and emerging businesses where they need to be. And we also provide money for creation and expansion of businesses in rural settings. A government shutdown would stop these programs. It would bring these programs to a dead halt in rural America. Why break the momentum? Our economy is just turning the corner. We do not need to do this. You know, we can't forget the role that the Ag Appropriations Bill plays in keeping our families and communities safe. And one thing I have to say is the Food and Drug Administration, they do a great job. Again, a lot of people just take them for granted because they do such a good job. But you know, we have the safest food supply in the world, and we have the safest drug supply in the world. Do we want to jeopardize that? No. Please, let's not jeopardize that. Why are we playing games with people's food and medicine? It makes no sense at all. In Arkansas alone, the FDA oversees, now this is unbelievable statistics, but in Arkansas alone, the FDA oversees 1,300 facilities. 1,300 facilities in my small state. And they also have presence there with the National Center for Toxicological Research in Jefferson County, and that employs about 500 people. And they do great things there, and it's a very important and vital part of what FDA does. We're certainly proud to have them there. Arkansas has 85 poultry and 50 meat processing plants. These are inspected by the Food Safety Inspection Service, FSIS. Last year, Senator Blunt, my good friend from Missouri, and I worked very hard with the chairwoman of the committee and others in this chamber to make sure that those meat inspectors stayed on the job, because the day that they miss, that jeopardizes thousands of private sector jobs and productivity and this disruption to a very, very efficient market. So we were able to do that here again. All that's in jeopardy because of the games that they're playing over with the House on this issue. The progress we've made when it comes to infrastructure would also stop. So we don't want to see that. We want to lay that foundation for future economic growth. We all know that infrastructure creates jobs, things like clean water, waste disposal system, broadband expansion. That's something we've been fighting for, not just in rural Arkansas, but in every rural state. These investments are critical to growing our nation's businesses, and they're critical to local communities. This helps all Americans. The programs I've talked about today They're supported by members of both sides of the aisle. Again, when we moved this through the committee, we got a 23-6 vote. Senator Blunt and I worked hand in hand on every single provision. We worked together. We produced a better bill because we did work together. It's good, solid case for bipartisanship and how you get things done. And it's really I think one of the strongest bipartisan votes we've had on the committee so far. But nonetheless, today, let me urge my colleagues to please follow the example of the Appropriations Committee generally, but the Ag-Approp Subcommittee specifically. Let's come together and let's do what's best for our economy and for the American people. And again, Mr. President, before I yield the floor, I want to thank Senator Mikulski for her leadership. It's not always easy to lead senators. They're like a bunch of cats sometimes trying to herd cats, but nonetheless, we are responding to her leadership because she's doing a great thing, not just for the state of Maryland, but for the country and for the Senate, and we appreciate that. Mr. President, with that, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.